Welcome back, everyone. I'm here again with Dr. David Morehouse. Before we start talking about the quantum mechanical interpretation of the mind and remote viewing, we're going to do a little bit of a lead up, and David's going to talk a little bit about human potential as it relates to the mind and remote viewing so that we get a better or firmer grounding as we talk about the quantum mechanical aspects of it. So, David, welcome back.
Hi, thanks, Sean. Hi, everybody.
So
Yeah.
in a prior episode, you talked about, or you gave out a tantalizing view that not only do we use less than 10% of the brain, we actually use 1% or less of our mental or brain capacity or of the mind. So can you talk a little bit about what theory underpins that?
Sure. And thanks for bringing that back up again, because I know that if your listeners are hearing that, there are a number of them that will immediately, look that up and go, well, that can't be, because even the old adage that we use less than 10% of our brains has now been proven to be a myth. So I wanted to kind of discuss that. Has it been proven to be a myth, or has it been misinterpreted as a myth? And so one of the things I wanted to take the listeners is kind of on a journey about that 10% idea and where it came from and what the origin might be and what the original intent of that was, as best we can conclude. So, I have heard that probably the first time I became aware of it was like as a junior high school student, and I certainly heard it again in high school, and I certainly heard it again at university, and I even heard it, in the Army. So it comes in various forms, from all manner of people, from scientists to professor to coaches. I think I had a wrestling coach in college that said that to, senior officers. I've had general officers use that term. So, that we're only using 10% of our brain. So it's like now in science, they call it a myth, but where did it come from? So different sources, like there's one that I looked at called faculty.washington.edu, and they claim that it may have been started or was likely started as a misquote of Albert Einstein. Okay. Then if you look at it again, there's another source that says Pierre Florenz, who was a French physician, and he was born back in 1794. And he had all of these discoveries about human brain function, cerebral localization, et cetera, et cetera. And, his findings were actually considered clear and consistent. And he would say things like, one can remove, he wrote this in 1824, one can remove from the front or the back or the top or the middle a certain portion of the cerebral lobes without destroying their function. For mental faculties to work properly, it seemed that just a small portion of the lobes sufficed. So some people believe that to be the origin of all of this. Other sources, you look at this and, in another early, incarnation of this idea, again, started back a guy by the name of Sigard in 1876, who wrote that the powers of the human brain, very people develop very much and very few perhaps ever will. So other believers are that is the origination of this 10% quote. Another such myth is, this idea that the right and left, well, I was going to talk about the right and left hemispheres of the brain, but we don't need to talk about that right now. But let's just say that scientists today consider this whole idea that the left and the right hemisphere of the brain are, like the left brain is logical and detail oriented, and the right brain is a seat of passion and creativity. And there are there are individuals today that step up and say that, that's a myth, that it's characterization of what the left and right hemispheres of the brain actually do. But, what I want you to understand is that to stand up and call that a myth, what it is it's itself wrong. The statement that itself is a myth, it's wrong. It's arrogant. It's a pretension to it's pretension to infallibility of the person saying that. Why? It's really easy in today's world of Google smarts. All one needs to do to kind of rise to a degree of superiority over others is to insert just one additional kernel of accuracy, real or perceived, in their mind. And in that case, the presenter of information, in this case, a guy by the name of Hickok, is writing this op-ed piece for the New York Times in 2014. He is a professor of cognitive sciences, but he overrides this generalization regarding left and right hemispheres of the brain, and in so doing, he completely disregards notables like Carl Jung and hundreds of thousands of psychiatrists and psychologists who routinely use what he's calling a myth to explain in lay terms to patients, or maybe even curious onlookers, how one can understand the functioning of the brain in some places. It's never been intended to be presented as an absolute. It's just interpreted by some individuals looking for a reason to be offended about what they're seeing, or afraid in some way that people are going to take a generalization being used by professionals in many cases to just write about and or explain to the general population about these are basic findings that we have. No one is even suggesting from those professions that that is an absolute, that if you removed if you remove the left side of the brain, that there would be no logic, or if you remove the right side of the brain, that one could not dream or imagine. But this is the kind of absolutism that we find creeping into almost everything in our life these days. And it's because it's so easy to find half-baked resources just on the internet, and people don't really dig down and do deep dive researches into things to find that out. And there are people like me and others who do. And so when we're saying something, that we're doing it, again, not necessarily from a point of absolutism, but simply from a perspective of trying to say, let's synthesize from everything that we know right now, because this is what the greatest scientists among us are capable of doing, and that's how they're categorizing their work. More on that in a minute. So I want to go back to this 10% myth origin. Since we segued into the left and right hemisphere of the brain, I wanted to make a point with that. So back to this 10% thing, it's like there's an organization for economic cooperation and development, in which I don't understand how they're defining where this 10% came from, but they did. And on their web page, they said they actually attributed this to Albert Einstein, claiming that Albert Einstein did say this, that he only used 10% of his brain, and he said it to a journalist as an answer to a question concerning his intelligence. And this kind of leads you to the first clue about where we're going with this, which is Einstein was not talking about the fact that he was only using 10% of his brain and that the other 90% was mush, right? Or going to be relegated to mush. What he was saying is that I'm probably only using the storage capacity of my brain to the level of 10%. That is a more accurate interpretation of what this adage meant, of someone saying this. And it gained, it went on into other ideas or other understandings of this by other scientists and or other organizations. In particular, there were some studies that were being developed by Harvard psychologists, William James and Boris Sidis, and this was in the 1890s, and they were testing the theory of accelerated learning or accelerated raising of a child prodigy, which was actually William Sidis, the son of Boris. And they were putting this out into audiences that they were lecturing to, talking about the fact that they believed in their studies that children, based on how they were raising and what we were putting into them, that they were only meeting a fraction of their full mental potential. And that at that time was considered a really plausible claim. It became an addition or, input to or additional information in support of, this 10% theory. That's people do that. They pull things together. And there's the statement by these two Harvard psychologists carried water. They were simply saying, we're not reaching our full mental storage capacity. It has, again, nothing to do with saying that 5%, which is what they were postulating, or 10%, or 15 or 20% of your brain, that means that the leftover that we're not talking about is somehow rendered inert. I mean, common sense, even in those days, and scientific basis of fact in those days, they knew that the entire brain was being utilized in some fashion, and not all at once, but in some fashion throughout the day, throughout any given activity or exercise or intellectual pursuit or artistic pursuit or intimate pursuit. It was all being utilized when it was needed, but they were talking about a storage capacity. They were talking about how much we can give a child or an adult, and, do we reach a fill point somewhere? So it's been a pet idea. Some people have claimed that this 10% came, like in 1932, people said that it was actually, it came out of the science fiction writer and editor John Campbell's thoughts, where he said no man in history ever used half of the thinking part of his brain. And so from there, people now looking back are going, well, a sci-fi writer talking about that kind of a thing, he must be referring to the 10% threshold, and therefore, this adds to the definition and explanation of it being a myth. Then you had American writer and broadcaster Lowell Thomas in 36, in Dale Carnegie, in the foreword to Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. He says that Professor William James of Harvard used to say that the average man develops only 10% of his of his latent mental ability. So here again, this becomes part of this 10% that keeps rising up and then being interpreted and reinterpreted. And where you should be going with this right now, because we're going to talk about this when we get into the quantum mechanical interpretations of quantum mind, is that every human being looking at one of these things turns it around and they interpret it through their own lens of study, research, understanding, or intent in the delivery of a statement like that. So in the 70s, there's a Belgian-born psychologist and educator, George Lozanov, and he says in a method of suggestopedia believing, I love that, that we might be using only 5 to 10% of our mental capacity. So he's a psychologist and an educator. Where did he come up with that? You think he was just drawing upon the statements made by others? Perhaps, probably not. Do you think he was quoting Campbell? Do you think he was, going after, the broadcaster, Lowell Thomas, and taking it from him? I doubt it very seriously. I'm sure that there was something as a psychologist and educator that he was extracting something from. Now that might be, that might be a supposition from me, but there is absolutely no proof to the contrary. But he came up with the same thing, that we may be using only 5 to 10% of our mental capacity. Mental capacity didn't say mental functioning of our brain, meaning the rest of it remains inert. There are more. There are neurosurgeons that are talking about guys that deal with brain function, brain hallucinations, deja vu, illusions, etc. One of them was this guy, was the first director of Montreal Neurological Institute of McGill University, and his name was Penfield. And he was a guy that put forward this idea, again, of limited use of cognitive ability. Again, none of them saying that the rest of the brain's not being used. But in Scientific American 2008, here it comes. A neurologist, John Henley of Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, turns around and said, the evidence would show over a day you use 100% of your brain. Another researcher comes forward and says that we use 100% of our brain. It would be ridiculous for us to think that we didn't use the 90% from the 10% myth, because if you didn't use the 90%, then it would go through a pruning, sort of a neural pruning where these neurons would just die off. And so you would then only be left with the tip. You see where I'm going with it? Then we'd be only left with the 10% that we were actually using. This individual, as a researcher, as a neuroscientist, is completely misinterpreting what's intended in the message from clear back in the 1800s, which is trying to think of the human brain as a storage capacitor. And if it was a storage capacitor, how much storage could it carry forward? How much would it be? And these individuals are trying, as neuroscientists, are scoffing at that, turning around, dismissing it all, misinterpreting the intention of it, and stepping back and saying, it's ridiculous. You use 100% all of the time. You couldn't not do it. If you didn't, then there would be a neuronal pruning, and the neurons would die off, which we know would not necessarily be the case. And then you have another individual, Gabrielle Antoine, in 2018, who comes forward and counters these other two researchers and says the idea that 100% of your brain would be used at any given time or all the time, as both researchers suggested. She says that that would not be desirable at all, because if in fact that was actually happening, that your brain was functioning, all of it at one time, yeah, you'd have an epileptic seizure. In fact, you'd be epileptic if that was the case. You'd have a lightning storm in your brain firing all your neurons. That's an epileptic seizure, kind of in lay terms. So I like that. And what does it mean? It means that there's a lot of interpretation. There's a lot of lack of or loss of understanding of where this phrase came from. The original intent, it's pretty clear just in, supposing all of those things and looking at them and understanding Einstein and how Einstein would have used it, and understanding the other researchers that were pulling it forward based on what they were doing, albeit they didn't have the tools that we have now, but that's not what they were after. These are people that are first understanding and the brain's function, and they were pulling different pieces and parts out of animal brains and going, look, it still works, and look, it still works, and look, we can go all the way down to this one place and it still works. So they were talking again about function. They were also talking about storage capacity, and they were talking about it in just simple capability terms, not which neurons and which dendrites and axons are connected, and which neurons are functioning and which ones aren't, and which parts of the brain are firing at one point in time. It was never intended to be that. And so to jump on that and turn around and call that whole idea a myth is popular. There's a lot of brio, that goes behind that kind of stuff, but it's unfounded, and it really misrepresents what it was there for. But if you were to type in 10% if you were to Google, to get Google Smart and check what the search engine shows you for this 10% capacity of human brain, you're going to see myth, 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 myth. There's, for 5 pages, there will be myth. So if you really want to find out more about it, ask a question like, where did it come from? And do the research on that and find how many interpretations of its origin and how much of a lack there is of its actual meaning that is available to you. And then ask yourself if that understanding forms the foundation for a scientific statement that it's a myth. It doesn't. It's a flawed logic to take it to that place. Mm-hmm. So where did this theory of 1% or a fractional 1% of the brain's neural capacity come from? That's the thing I mentioned twice here. And I wanted to make sure that you all understood that, so you didn't think that and relate that statement to the 10% now being considered a myth by new science. It's really simple. Where did that come from? Supposition. Kind of an uncertain belief based on the facts as we know them or think we know them regarding human brain storage capacity. Understanding it the best of the brightest in science, physics, or anything else that, they always see as much through the observer lens as they do the evaluator lens in their life and in their craft or their science. And the observer lens says, I always know there's another variation of everything, and therefore I don't draw hard conclusions about things. And the evaluator lens says there's only one version of anything, it's my version, and therefore I do draw conclusions about things. So understanding that is, something I think we will talk about or at some other time. I certainly talk about it a lot in my lectures, and I talk about it a lot in my classes about what that means in terms of that's an empowered, impassioned intention, and an impassioned intention causes an individual to understand that they have an observer role and evaluator role, and both are governed simply by choice. And there is a silo of actions through both of those roles, observer and evaluator. One is more powerful than the other, but both are necessary. But that's why I'm saying that the greatest scientists among us understand that both are necessary. And it is only those who seek an absolute version of what they're working on that stand in the evaluator role, because that's what evaluation is all about, absolutism. And in science, that is the wrong way to approach it. The latest Temple Award winner not latest again, it's like 2018, 2019, Temple Award winner as an a theoretical physicist, said very carefully when asked the question about those who don't believe in things beyond the physical, et cetera, and don't believe in the use of quantum mechanical interpretations to describe quantum mind, et cetera, said those are individuals who have a very limited range of perspective as scientists. In fact, their perspective is as wrong as they are trying to make others wrong. They are seeking absolutes. They are absolutists. And absolutism in the realm of science, while you might think that's necessary, it's actually a limiter. It's a rate limiter in the work and the interpretation and the establishment of new theses and moving forward in it. Because even in the world of physics, as I've said, and you'll hear me say it again later, the greatest physicists among us are the individuals that step forward and go, yep, it's an interpretation. And by that, we mean that even though we have mathematical proofs to establish our interpretations, it could all be BS 5 minutes from now. Why? Mm-hmm. Because something new gets discovered. There's a new variable. There's a new variable in the equation, therefore the equation changes. If the equation changes, then the expected outcome may change. And if that changes, then it's a whole new hypothesis. and the work continues. It's a continuum because it's a constant changing. Science, I once heard from a physicist say, it is an imperfect craft, a self-correcting craft, and it is a craft that is in constant movement and flux. There are not absolutes. No matter what you think there is, and I don't care from what level of science that you want to take it, what it is right now is not what it was 50 years ago. It's not what it was 100 years ago. And what it is right now will be different 20 years from now. It could be different next year, right? So there are so many things that we have to be willing to embrace, that, yeah, 2 + 2 = 4, but as we expand the logic outward into interpretation of the world around us, it changes, it alters, it fluxes, right? So this idea of 1% fractional is again talking to a storage capacity. And so where did it come from? Why is that out there now? Well, quantifying, the storage capacity of the human brain is complex, as you could possibly, as you might imagine, right? So although in, cognitive neuroscience, scientists are often compare the brain to computers, this is really it's not an exact comparison, and it's really in many ways not a good comparison, either in terms of storage capacity or of speed. But it is what's put out there, because why? Because they're trying to get the layperson to have some sort of an understanding of what it is that they're saying to them. So they're trying to put it back in some quantifiable way in which we can wrap our heads around it and say, oh, I get that. I don't know what it would have been pre-computers. I guess could have been volumes of water. I have no idea. Or measurements of, troy ounces of gold or something. I don't know, but this is what we have now. And even some of these scientists who are now saying, are turning their nose up and calling the 10% statement or theory as myth. It's not actually myth. It was what they had at the time, right? And it worked at the time, just as much as us turning around and trying to compare the cognitive function and memory storage of the human brain to, to a TEP speed or flop speed, of a computer, or, the size of the hard drive in the computer. You're talking about a biological brain that we absolutely, right up to this point in time, right now, here today, do not fully understand how it weaves together the neuronal network of memory, and that we don't know. And every time we keep looking, we find new elements to it, like that. There are beliefs and theories now that it's cognating omnidirectionally, which would be just perfect, for a quantum mechanical interpretation of that. But cognating omnidirectionally, that's an interesting idea. But the way they're measuring it right now is almost taking it back to a binaural function and trying to say, instead of ones and zeros and the speed with which the 1 and 0 can flop, they're taking and saying the speed with which neurons can be activated, right? And transposing that over into an interpretation of speed. But, we've got all these theoretical comparisons and all research hypotheses, and, we can't take them as an absolute. So let's just talk about the storage capacity of a human brain. So there are estimates of the brain's information storage capacity. They can vary up to 10 to the 13th power to 10 to the 18th power in bytes to the computer. So there's a UC Berkeley pair of neuroscientists who, in the last 10 years, stated that the human storage capacity is anywhere from 1 terabyte to 10 terabytes. What? Seriously, guys?
Yeah.
You come on. I mean, I wouldn't believe that on my worst day. So back to the lab, guys. I don't even know what you're talking about. 1 terabyte to 10 terabytes. Yeah, I could put that on a thumb drive. So no. Northwestern University neuroscientist says that his study, his research in his lab is, it's 2.5 petabytes, or 1,000,000 gigabytes is what that, and well, all of you know how that works. It's 1,000 kilobytes equals a byte. 1,000 bytes equals a megabyte. 1,000 megabytes equals a gigabyte. 1,000 gigabytes equals a terabyte. 1,000 terabytes equals, right? And so that goes like that, increments of 1,000. Now, the one I love, and the one that I am using in my referencing is a researcher. They were talked about in psychology that talks. They claim that it's 1,000 petabytes or 1 exabyte. 1,000 petabytes. The Northwestern guys, 2.5 petabytes. But petabyte or 1 exabyte, 1,000 petabytes is 1 exabyte. Just 1,000 keeps going up. So again, the scientists who come to that conclusion, and understanding, once again, you're talking about human neural capacity, storage capacity, which we do not fully understand. So we are estimating it to be upwards of 1 exabyte with variations, give or take 1 exabyte. So what about the cognitive speed of human thought? If you want to read more about it, other than what I'm going to tell you, go ahead and pull up Dr. Elizabeth Rauscher, PhD physicist, and read what she has to say about about the speed of human thought. Her conclusions are that it is faster than the cosmological constant of the speed of light. You can read her independent research. You can also read her joint research between her and Russell Targ, another PhD physicist, in their conclusions that human thought moves faster. In other words, we cognate faster than the speed of light. They take it from a different perspective than these researchers. They're taking it from a physics perspective. It's still really interesting, and it's still really inspirational to read what they're doing. They're smart people. But other researchers are, keeping it a little bit more grounded. But they're talking about, they're measuring this. They're using TEPs, or traversed edges per second. Can't talk today, to measure a computer's ability to communicate information internally within the computer. So they can estimate the human brain's communication performance in TEPs. And they're trying to assign this, meaningfully to kind of compare the brain's speed to the cognitive speed of the computer. And so they estimate it to be 0.18 to 6.4 times 1014 TEPs. And so that gives them an order of magnitude for our cognition to be more than the existing supercomputers. So to give you that comparison, that equation I just gave you equates to 18 to 640 trillion TEPs, while the closest supercomputer is 23 trillion TEPs. So humans cognate 18 to 640 trillion TEPs, right? These traversed edges per second. And the fastest supercomputer, the closest supercomputer, is 23 trillion TEPs. So 1 exabyte, upwards of 640 trillion TEPs. That makes us pretty unique in between our ears. Is it all true? It is for now. And because this is what we have based on our current understanding of the workings of the human neuronal functioning and speed. And tomorrow it may be faster. And very few neuroscientists believe that it's going to go backward, meaning it's going to be less storage capacity or proven to be slower than what they're estimating now. But all of the best neuroscientists that are looking at this are saying that, look, these are estimates, but really what would be more accurate in applying them is, despite the mathematical proofs that we have to shore them up, they're guesstimates. That's what they're saying. These are guesstimates, meaning that tomorrow it could all change. It could all change. And hence the statement of 1% or fractional 1% of neural capacity for storage.
Now, why do they say it's only it's a fractional percent of one, or fractional percent of 1%?
It's a supposition based on overall neural storage capacity, which is now, it was, I think it's only been in the last 24 months that it went from what was considered to be the outside range of 2.5 petabytes now up to 1 exabyte. So it's, in truth, Sean, it's an excellent question. That's why I'm saying it's supposition. It's an uncertain belief. And why is it an uncertain belief? Because we don't really know. We don't even really know how knowledge and memory is stored. We have a basic rudimentary idea, but we really don't know how it's stored. We don't. We keep, about every time neuroscientists think they know, then they find out that the actual, the way in which the neurons are connecting and reconnecting, and the role in which glial cells, which, 15 years ago, maybe, glial cells were considered to be the glue that held the neurons in place. Now, they understand that glia cells actually play a role in cognition and, in retrieval and storage and other things. So again, we just keep learning more and more and more. So it's supposition. It's saying, okay, since we jumped from 2.5 as the basic, kind of the common high-end threshold until 2 years ago, now new research at a new university takes it up to the 1 exabyte. Well, that's more than 2.5. That's up, if you go back to the petabytes, that's 1,000 petabytes from the previous threshold of 2.5. So the idea then, if you were just, again, carrying forward the 10% idea, which again was simply a guesstimation that started in 1880s, then, or further back, it is just a supposition. It's meaning that we had no idea that our estimations for speed and capacity would ever reach what they are right now, and we're still discovering more. And so again, it should carry the same weight in people's minds as the 10% did. It's just an interpretation to say, holy cow, look at what we've got. Look what we're capable of. So I think instead of just carrying the 10% forward, there's a new, quantifying of it, saying if our capacity is shot this far forward, then our total volume reached should descend the other direction, right? And the truth is, we really have no idea. We don't know how much is being used, and how much is being used would differ from each individual, right? Some people, it may not go very far. Some people, it may go well out past that. So I think that the statements are being kind of thrown out as an average, but really what they're kind of being thrown out for is to inspire. I think that's what the objective is here. It's to inspire, not to go find a reason to pick something apart, which is what I brought that up. There are ample guys that, either do or don't work in the field and then they go, they get smart on something, and then they pull up some argument that's not really, even the argument's not tested, and then they just throw that out there to like knock down what others are saying and call it a myth. And so listen to me now, I'm important. And the idea in putting any of this stuff out there from most of the people that are doing it, most of them, is to inspire people to understand that, there's greatness in them. There's greatness in human beings that has not yet, in many cases, been realized. And I just want, I always hate sports analogies and this stuff, but I heard Wayne Gretzky on, my son played hockey, and I heard Wayne Gretzky. My son had a hockey coach one time. I won't mention his name, but this guy used to pontificate, at hour and hours over dinners and things, telling me why the kids playing on his team would never play in the NHL. And it was always about, they didn't have the right types of muscle fibers, and, they didn't have this kind of thing and that kind of thing, which was pseudoscience when he was throwing it out there, but it was pseudoscience that coaches at all levels were adopting, and were turning around and, trying to choose players based on physique and, their combine speeds, the strength of their shots, all these different things. Well, Wayne Gretzky, if you've read his book and heard him talk, he says that in any combine, any measurement that he was ever in, he was always at the bottom of the group. He did not have the fastest shot. He did not have the strongest shot. I think he ran a 5.6 40. He could not, bench press the weight that most guys were bench pressing a minimum of 10 and some upwards of 25 times. He couldn't do it once. His vertical leap was the lowest. But Gretzky used to be a guy, what he did was, back at the age of something like 6, as was in his book, he would draw an ice rink on a piece of paper, blank piece of paper on a clipboard, and he would watch the hockey game. And from whistle to whistle, what he would do is, without looking at the paper, he would follow the puck in play, and he was moving his hands and moving with the puck over here, back over to here, back over to here, back over here. Why was he doing that? Whistle to whistle. Then he would mark that number 1, right? He'd go to the next one. He'd map out an entire game like this. And as a young child, he started looking at the patterns of the puck movement on the ice. So if you've ever heard him talk or read his books, he's always said, I was not fast, but I was fast enough to be where the puck was going to be, not where the puck was, right? Mm-hmm. And that is how he started to develop that. So it was all mental for him. The game became mental. It was an impassioned intention that drove everything that he did, doing things like that. As he said, I didn't have the strongest or the fastest shot, but I guarantee you, I had the most accurate shot. And I knew where to be in order to get the puck. And it wasn't about me being able to outrun some defenseman or somebody, or center, or anybody else. It was because I had a step on him, because in my head, I already knew where it was going to be. That wasn't clairvoyance. That was, developing an understanding of the patterns of the game, and understanding that typically when something is here, it's going to come out here or here, and then choose based on the positioning of players. It's like Tom Brady too, right? Now considered what? Greatest quarterback of all time, Super Bowl winning? I don't know. I don't watch it. I've never seen him play. But I know he's considered to be really good. And I also know that in his combine scores, he was considered really atrocious. Like his vertical leap, his 40, he was like the lowest in virtually every measurable area. In fact, I think they called him the slowest quarterback in combine history. And slowest quarterback in combine history, or slowest quarterback in the draft. And I did once see this picture of him that for the combines, and he looked like, he had this little, midriff bulge around there. He didn't have big, broad shoulders, did not have big, big burly arms, didn't have big 6-pack abs, didn't have any of those things. So by all of the measurements, all the metrics, right, that all the NFL teams would use to decide whether he was worth it or not, he didn't measure up. But what he was good at was understanding the mental pieces of the game at the speed of human thought. And from the snap of the ball, being able to back up and repeatedly scan and position players instantaneously, and even know where they were going before probably they did, and being able to pick those kinds of defenses apart. And because of that, for him it was a mental game, and it was a mental game that he excelled at, because it was an impassioned intention for him all of his life, not to play in the NFL, but to be the best that he could possibly be in what he was trying to do. And the same thing for Wayne Gretzky. It wasn't about, the pursuit of the NHL. For him, it was about just pursuit of his own passion, the excellence in his own passion. What he was after was to be the best he could be at what he was passionate about, which was hockey. And all the rest came afterward. I just think that's an important concept to instill in children today, which is, I think I saw like coming out of those Carnegie things. It's like, don't dance because it's good for you, dance because you love it. There are a million of them, of those kinds of things. And that's important for children today to realize that if you're doing something because of a goal in mind, like you're gonna something down the road, and people will disagree with this, but it's a recipe for failure, because you're not actually doing it. The idea of doing it is to be impassioned about it, and to do it and to be good at it because it's important to you to be good at it. It's because it's your passion. You love it. So you want to be impeccable in it for you, not for the room, not for, anybody else, not for the world, and not for the NHL, not for the, NFL. You want to be as good as you can be at it to satisfy you, right? To satisfy you. And if you pursue something like that, that goes back to this whole notion of how you're resonating in the moment, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what brings these different potentials in. But if you're focusing on, a potential 20 years from now or 10 years from now, if that's your focus, then as Itzhak Bentov or Paul Dirac or anybody that's talking about, and even if you want to go to the spiritual teachers, it would be John Kabat-Zinn, Deepak Chopra, Eckhart Tolle, it would be Thich Nhat Hanh, it could be Dwayne Dyer, it could be all these guys have been spending a lifetime trying to get people to understand, Warner Earhart, getting people to understand that what's important is how you are living right now. I just saw, I like to follow MotoGP, and I saw a statement from an engineer in MotoGP that said, if you want to be successful, if you want to be a world champion in MotoGP, you have to be very present all the time throughout the entire race. And what he meant was not focusing on the end of the race or what happened at the last turn, but right now, right? Right now, because that's all that rider at that speed is in charge of is right now. And if that rider takes their concentration out of that and thinks 2 turns down the road, that's when they fail in the turn they're in, and then they lay the bike down, or worse. And going back to, I think, what we talked about earlier in another episode, we talked about Colonel John Boyd and his the OODA loop.
Mm-hmm.
His statement of, in my mind, I see what my opponent is doing. Okay, different story than saying I'm looking, he's not looking 30 seconds down in a dogfight. He's looking in an infinitesimal milliseconds, right, beyond the present right now. So that is not affecting. That's within the change distribution, right, funnel, or the probability distribution funnel. So it's not taking his thoughts away or his mind away from what he's focusing on right now. It's literally less than the snap of a finger to the other side or outside the theoretical moment, right? Anyway, sometimes difficult for people to draw those conclusions. Do you have another question on that? I love your question.
So this is sound a little crazy, but it may relate to remote viewing and this concept of percentage of the brain that we use, at least in storage capacity. A lot of the notions that you're talking about presuppose or seem to presuppose a materialist conception of the brain and what storage capacity means.
Yeah.
When you extend that to the realm of consciousness, where do these ideas come from? Do they come, are they just generated from that physical brain cells, or is there something that's broader, that's potentially non-physical, where these ideas come from the outside as opposed to the inside?
That's an excellent question. A complex answer. Let me see if I can. In the quantum mechanical interpretation of things, it is, the phrase is used that everything is energy and energy is everything, and therefore everything can be expressed as waveform on some level. So if you're talking about even the biological brain, the body, the environment that you're in, at the quantum or subquantum level, how is that expressed? And from a quantum mechanical perspective, it all exists in waveform. There are reasons why we see the physical world around us, but at the subatomic level, I mean, not subatomic, but at the quantum level, subatomic as well, quantum, subquantum level, it is considered all as waveform. And therefore, if it's waveform, quantum mechanical interpretations of particle wave theory state that if something is not observed or is not being observed, or let's say when something is observed, it coalesces into a position. And people always ask me, well, what does observed mean? Well, observed means measured in terms of a physics perspective, right? It means measured. So usually in the lab, that's an instrumentation. And so when there's an instrumentation, they are observing a particular waveform. And when they observe it or measure it, it coalesces up. It makes a spike on the oscilloscope, right? And so that's a position. They mark a position. And when they basically turn the measurement off, then it decoheres back into waveform. And when they turn the measurement on again, it coalesces back up into another position. And when they stop that, it collapses back into waveform. Now, there were old Newtonian concepts of that, which would say that the waveform went from position 1 to position 2 or to position 3 by the most direct path. A quantum mechanical interpretation of that says, no, and they have good reasons to refute that from the classical interpretation. And they will say that it travels by every possible path. Therefore, it is omnidirectional. And if it is omnidirectional, it is omnipresent. And so when you're talking about human consciousness versus human brain, you're saying that consciousness doesn't just involve the brain, it involves every aspect of the human and every aspect of all humans, collectively and individually. So you hear terms that go like the collective consciousness or collective unconsciousness. You hear all kinds of things like morphic resonance, 100th monkey effect. All of these things are descriptions and discussions of the fact that we have an individual consciousness and a collective consciousness. And then if the deeper you go into spiritual pursuits, they go into the consciousness of all things. And in order for us or anything, all things, to share, to understand, to share and interact in the ways that great spiritual teachers are putting forward to humanity, it means that there has to be a waveform expression that we are all intermingled with. People will come back and use examples like, again, not to try to say that human consciousness is that way, trying to say, give people a thought experiment or a thought reality to say, consider this as to what we're talking about here. Like aspen trees all share a common root system. And that doesn't mean they all have roots. It means that they are all, if there is a grove of aspen trees, that grove, all those trees in that grove are tied in at the root system together. So the nutrients are shared, the water is shared, it's distributed, right? It is a common, circulatory system, nutritional system that they share. Now, of course, if there are aspen trees on the other mountain, they aren't sharing the same root system, but taking that one simple microcosm and saying, check this out. This is what we're talking about. We're saying that humanity is connected in this way. And in fact, humanity is connected in this way. And you could say in the aspen trees that not only are they connected physically, but they are also, as those tentacles and microfibers go down into the earth and the other places, right? That they are one with their environment, right? Would be a spiritual, explanation of that. So that's not what we're talking about, but it is just a model that we're saying, okay, as Deepak Chopra would say, and others, as is the micro, so is the macro. So if you're looking at something like that, understand that that can be templated up and used as an understanding of what's going on within our lives, that we are all connected in some way, that at this level of where we exist as waveform, that we cannot exist as waveform that travels by every possible path and that is therefore omnipresent, that you and I cannot share access to that waveform, to each other's waveform, to the waveform expression of all others, all other things. We can't separate ourselves from that. If it is truly omnipresent and each of us has that, is that at this quantum, subquantum level, then you cannot distinguish yourself as something separate from that. You can't cut yourself out of that equation. And then the issue is, well, then what are the limits of that? Where does it stop? Well, if it travels by every possible path based on the interpretation of that, then it doesn't stop anywhere. Well, does it stop at the edge of the known universe? Why? Why would it? If that were true, then what happens to the waveform expression, the energy expression of things at the edge of the known universe? What happens to that? Does it bounce off something? Is it like Truman, where it hits a hard object and jumps back. No, there would be no physics explanation or understanding as to why that would happen. So then does that mean, at least in these broad terms in which we're talking, does it mean that if the waveform expression of all things travels by every possible path and is therefore omnipresent, does that mean that we are sharing or standing within the waveform expression of other universes, or elements of other universes, or life forms in other universes, material in other universes, thoughts in other universes? It does mean that, which some people just they want their head to explode when they hear that. But it means once you grasp the notion of omnipotence, omniscience, omnipresence, and an eternal aspect of a waveform expression, which is us, then and all of us, then it allows you to kind of wrap your head around the idea that defines who and what we are. And my question is, what I've always said is, why is that so difficult for us to grasp that would be possible for us? We easily ascribe that. 98% of the population of the planet ascribes that to something that is like, at the end of the e-ticket ride of life, right? When you die, then you get to realize that. Why? Why is that so difficult to understand that all research in pediatric psychiatry, et cetera, say that children born into this existence, when questioned about it, particularly before things layer over the top of it, talk about that. They talk about, having a remembrance of something, of where they came from, why they're here, what they're supposed to do while they're here. These are not, this is not wild ass crazy stuff. This is stuff that has been substantiated by peer-reviewed research in psychiatric, pediatrics, and adolescence for decades and decades. It has been there. Started in Scandinavia, and then North America, tried to catch up and did, and Europeans have caught up. Now, not everybody agrees, but there is a preponderance of research that does agree with that. And of course, in variations, as with everything else, like 10%, 1%, or the speed with which we cognate or anything else. Yeah, there are variations of those interpretations, but there is a general sense of agreement in those studies that say, yeah, there is evidence or clear evidence in some cases that we have that ability, that we came here with something. And then if you take it to Russell Targ and SRI International, as I said, I'm grateful for two things that came out of SRI as a remote viewer. I mean, I think that there were two things that were of value to me as a human being. Mm-hmm. The first was that they scientifically validated this human ability, to which even the CIA brought in auditors, as I said. They brought auditors in to check their science, not because the CIA wanted to be right, but because the CIA wanted to make sure that they weren't going to get caught holding a bag of something and have egg on their face. They wanted to make sure that others agreed what these guys were saying, and they did. So you can see all sorts of skeptics out there and, oh, pshaw, go on, doesn't work. Okay, then go refute their science. You don't need to argue it with me because I won't argue it with you, but refute their science. Go ahead, jump in. Oh, there have been some guys, I told you, there have been guys that walked in and said, well, this and well, that. And I can actually see, like this New Zealand guy, when he did some of the things he brought up, I would have said the same thing. Mm-hmm. Said, you're right. The monitor was probably leading this guy, and the monitor should have been removed from the equation, and there should have been a different way in which to do it, that's why in the remote viewing unit, as soon as you graduated and became operational, you had the right to turn around and go, I don't want a monitor anywhere near me ever again, which is what I did, because I didn't want somebody to influence me or annoy me in a remote viewing session. I just wanted to do the work. I didn't want to do their work. I wanted to do my work. So I had no desire. And that's the way I teach it now, is you don't get monitors. You don't get a monitor, somebody to drive you along. But that being said, still, and I understand that guy, the guy that in the Nova video, which came out way back in the 70s, in that Nova video, I think his criticism of what they were doing was a little harsh, but I also agree with why he criticized it, because they shouldn't have been using monitors the way they were using monitors. It was corrupting. It's called investigator bias. And the investigators were definitely biased. So they should have come up with a different way in which to do it. Now, after the audits came in, I think the same points were made. And I believe that they altered their methodology. They stopped using latitude and longitude as well. They never even tried grid Mercator. They never used Cartesian. Those didn't fit. But wherever they got with it, it never got as far as what happened once it was brought over to be used as an intelligence collection methodology. So remember, one was experimentation, right? Quantifying that experiment, quantifying the data, changing the metrics around, again, experiment, quantify the data, come up with a conclusion and put it forward. So the first one that I bought into, that I liked and got purchase from, was that they had scientifically validated that human beings had this ability. ESP, clairvoyance, whatever you want to call it, those days. And the second thing was they concluded that everybody had the ability, that there was nothing special or unique about any of the people that they had brought out of the population and brought in there to do that, that they could get basically the same result from anybody as long as they were willing to experiment and try. So that meant like just some kid off the Stanford campus, I assume, that they could drag in and say, hey, you want to do this? I'm always thinking about the Ghostbusters image of Bill Murray standing there, making eyes at the young co-ed, and then the other guy, and he's shocking the other guy, shocks the gum out of his mouth. Remember that kind of thing? Yeah. So paying him $5 to sit there and do it. Again, investigator bias on the one trying to pick up the girl. But anyway, that cracked me up, because I was thinking, well, that's probably what it was like at SRI. They just go grab a kid off the Stanford campus, want to make $25 or $5. And then they would do something like that. Can you tell me what's on the other side of the card? But I don't know if that was their methodology that got them to the point that they actually were doing these more complex exercises. I would submit that was the reason that the CIA gave them the contract, is because they didn't say that they were going to repeat all this standard stuff that others had done in the past. They were going to do complex things, which were, in the lexicon of remote viewing, it means we're going to send you to a complex gestalt, right? A complex gestalt, a single gestalt, meaning that a target gestalt would mean that the gestalt would be greater than the sum of its individual parts. So that means that there could be tangible as well as intangible aspects of it, right? There could be dimensional as well as energetic. There could be emotional aspects of that thing, which are not parts, right? That are there, but they're part of the imprint that's present there. So that's what a gestalt of a target means. They're complex. It's not a ball in a box, right? Mm-hmm. You're not going to put a feather in an envelope and say, can you describe what's in the envelope? That's a parlor trick. That's a parlor trick. That's not remote viewing. So this was something that from its start out of the gate became something far more reaching, far greater implications, far more sophisticated, and really stretched human ability from what it was previously thought to be. The measurement of that was. So those two things to me were most powerful. And that's kind of where it left off as I looked at all else in the historical file that referenced what they were doing. I was intrigued by their outbounder stuff, is what they called it. It was later called beaconing. meaning a beacon being akin to a, like a searchlight in the darkness, that kind of idea. And that was, you could send someone to look at something, and then you could have viewers access what that person was looking at through them or by them, however you wanted to look at that. And there were different techniques that were talked about and utilized there. And they were not doing it that way. They were doing it that way, but they were doing it in a way that was easily corruptible, in my opinion. Unfortunately, as there is an exercise done in a documentary called Superhumans, done by one of my former colleagues, Paul Smith, and some associate of his, where they bring some female actor in. And of course, the person that's going to be the beacon picks up the person from the airport that's going to be doing the remote viewing exercise and drives her through the very town and city. Past the very places that are going to be, that this person is going to be asked to, describe. So whether this is done consciously or subconsciously or unconsciously, I have no idea, but it is the very kind of thing that I would never do. And it's why I would never use a beacon. I would never say, we're going to do a beaconing exercise. And then knowingly, I would never put the beacon right in the same city. I wouldn't even put them practically in the same state. I always have taken somebody, if that's doing something in California, somebody's going to be doing something in New York or Washington, D.C. as the beacon, or they're going to be in Europe and, the Eiffel Tower or something. I would never, ever, drive the remote viewing students around in a bus past something and then take them over and expect that they weren't going to start describing what they had just seen. And in that superhuman exercise, they call it is so fundamentally flawed in looking at it, because all of those things that should not be done are done. So a woman that comes in and deposits the actress to Paul and says, Paul's going to train you now. And then this woman excuses herself. So after like an hour or two of training, then Paul goes, okay, so now we're going to do a beaconing exercise. And so, of course, the girl calls upon her, she calls on and starts describing the girl, the one that brought her there. And she starts describing aspects of that city where she is, where she's in, the town that she's in. And she starts describing it's Christmas. So she describes Christmas lights. No, wow, big deal there, right? And describes, hearing Christmas music, children playing and blah, blah, blah. So all of it, in my opinion, is a really, really bad example of what is possible. And if you really, there are other examples that are out there, proof positive, or there's some other stuff that's been done, some of the stuff that I did and other things, because it's done blind and it's done, in raw, pure viewing fashion, where you just let the viewers go out and do what they're going to do, and they have no idea what they're doing or where they're going to do it. And then the stuff gets gathered. And then you sit with a producer and go, okay, what do you think about this? Look at all this stuff. You let the producer pick what they think, means something to them about the proof of remote viewing. Not to quibble with the method of my former colleague, but I would not have done that exercise that way. And I don't think it proves anything near the capabilities of human beings in this phenomenon of remote viewing. It is easily debunked and chalked up as, well, of course she heard Christmas music and saw Christmas lights, and of course it was cold outside, and et cetera, right? So did you have another question? Did I answer your question?
Yeah, you did. I think now that we should probably go to the next episode to talk in more detail about the quantum mechanical aspects of remote viewing. So thank you again, and see you in the next episode.
If you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.